Hi, welcome back for part two. I just thought I'd get some props. I'm sort of like had a few abortive attempts. It was about take 4, but this was the series on Romans. This is the sort of like the modern sort of like cover bit. Say, for example, this is chapter 13, and this is actually how many pages on this? This has got like, say, for example, this has got over 300 pages of commentary, exegesis, exposition on Romans 13. That's just Romans 13. This, if you see this, how many pages has this got? This is 500 pages, and this is Romans 8, verses 17 to 39. So that's why I was saying the entire series is like this. But it just shows you how, for analysis and for expositional preaching, is generally considered to be probably the finest expositional preacher of the 20th century, and you can see why. And I think to be honest, I think he's one of the finest expositors ever. And so that's one of the reasons why, when I read his account of Romans 13, particularly because of my sort of like my background in sort of like radical politics, and it was a real, it really, and with the, with the tyranny of COVID and sort of, it really helped to sort of to understand our relationship with this. And I think this is why, our relationship to the state, our relationship to authority generally, because in the history of the church has been a lot of different attitudes and a lot of different groups, and some of them are very violently anti-state, and were involved in insurrections and revolutions and were killed very brutally. If you know anything about sort of like the Munster Rebellion and Thomas Munster, there was the DDR, even though he was what was called an Anabaptist, and the Anabaptists were were in the reform they were reformers, but they were called radical reformers. So you had Luther, Calvin, and then you had Zwingli in between Luther and Calvin, and at the same time you had these radical reformers who took some of the views of the reformers and then really pushed them to the extremes, or really interpret, and the Anabaptists were famous in the sense of for rejecting earthly authority and for making the very clear distinction between, say, the spiritual realm, and when you're, this is one of the themes that we'll sort of like look at, is when you're, when you become a believer, you enter into the kingdom of God, suddenly you're detached from the kingdom of the world. That was very much their view, is that the flesh, or the world, the world of the natural world, your flesh and body, and the spiritual world and the spiritual way of looking at things were completely distinct and separate, and we were to be subject only to the spiritual authority of God, and not the natural corrupt authority of man. And so they were very radical, and Thomas Munster was one of these radical Anabaptists, and they were very much into community of goods. They, in many ways, they prefigured what became a lot of the, you would call it proto-socialism in many ways, and that was why he was celebrated in the 20th century by the Deutsche Democratic Republic. They did the, so German Thomas Munster, they were sort of in the area that you now call Germany, and they celebrated him as an early communist, because they had community of goods. They wanted to have sort of like their own law. They were exalting the poor, getting rid of the aristocrats. So there was all this theme that was coming out that was called the Radical Reformation, and but that was put down as very violently in the end. I think there was a lot of death, but the Mennonites and the Amish were related to that group, and I think that's one of the reasons why they ended up. They have Anabaptist roots. So, and there are some interesting aspects of Anabaptist thought where they got some things very much right, which we will look at they got a lot wrong and they pushed lots of things to the extremes. On the particular issue of the relationship between church and state, they got that aspect right. So, it's me. Pray for my voice here. It's a bit funny. Thank you, Lord. So, let's have a look at Romans 13. Let's read it and give it surface reading. I was reading from the net. I'm going to read from the Net Bible, and the Net Bible is really, really interesting because the history of the Net Bible it's one of the, it's almost like what you call like a crowdsourced sort of communal online web project, but it's had lots and lots of academic input. And if you've ever heard of sort of like Wallace's a Greek grammar beyond the basics, he was involved in that project, and they've had a lot of input in from the Nestle Island, if you know anything about the sort of the standard Greek texts. So it's really interesting, and they've got lots of sort of notes on the text. It's actually netbible.org, and they've recently enhanced it quite significantly since the last time I looked at it, and they've now got. I knew that they'd done some projects where they were looking at the Greek text and tying the texts together, and they look like some of that works in the last 12 months has finally, I think it must have been a delay of a few years, because I can remember reading about they've got some of this stuff, some of the, I think in the printed text of the introduction to, I've got like an online electronic Bible software. Mine's quite out of date, because this particular, it was called Bible Works, but they stopped trading I think a few years ago. But they've got like in the preamble, they've got like a lot of the introductions people have written, I think, and they had the Net Bible had like a big preamble, and it was talking about all these different projects that were going on underneath this banner. And I can remember going to the website really excited and then not seeing much on the website. And I was thinking, oh, this must, like, you do get like a lot of these online early web projects where people got really excited about uh, about the internet and the democratization of information, and then suddenly you think, well, how are we going to make any money? And so a lot of those early projects, I think, crumbled. And I thought that had happened to the Net Bible project, but they really look like they've had quite a lot of new stuff that's on their site now, and it was really impressive when I went on there. But it's a really interesting translation, because and the notes are good. Some of the commentaries are a bit off, I think, and you can tell that there's a little bit of a bias that comes in at certain points, but they really do try and make a good tie it into the Greek text, and it's effective and it's clear modern English. That's what I like. I can't stand this, worship of the King James, ancient Elizabethan language. Some of the Psalms sound beautiful in Old English, but often you don't. It's not. You want to actually understand what you're reading as well, and if somebody says, "Oh, it behooves me to something," then what does the word behoove mean? It's a word that fell out of use probably at least 100 and 200 years ago, and so you get all these, there's people that consider, there's the whole King James debate. They consider that they actually consider it to as some people actually believe in what they call double revelation, which is where they believe that obviously the biblical languages are Hebrew and Greek, the main ones. There's some Aramaic and there's some other stuff in the Hebrew scriptures as well. But basically, the Old Testament, what you would call traditionally called the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, they were written in Hebrew, and the what you would call the New Testament or the Christian scriptures were written in Greek. And so whether some people actually believe that when the King James was translated, that God specially anointed those translators, and that it was like the English that came out of that translation was as divinely inspired as the original language. It's called double revelation. And that's why some people are really consider the King James. We can't touch the King James. It's the best version. There was an amazing that the fact that there is a debate, regarding that is remarkable, because language changes, the use of words changes, words get archaic. Well, I have heard people who are, that are basically very sane defending that view, and said that once you understand the shortcomings of the King James version, at least they're prepared to admit there are shortcomings, but said, and once you understand the way certain words aren't used, it's still the most amazing version, and it is a monumental achievement but it was very much, though, still built on sort of like on the Tyndale version, the Wycliffe version. These guys, deserve as equal as recognition of their astonishing words, especially Wycliffe. Wycliffe, in the sense, in translating the scriptures, he really defined English, because with he chose what was called the Anglo-Saxon dialect in Britain, in the British Isles, which, if you have a look at an older map, even now, the Anglia is like the bit of Britain that sort of sticks out on the side just above London. That's Anglia, and the Anglo-Saxons actually came from the Angles, and the Saxons came from what Germania, which is roughly equivalent to where Germany is now, and they're colonized and conquered most of particularly the eastern part of the country, and that was their strength. And the Celtic fringe on the west where we're from, the Celtic fringe managed to survive, in the sense, in the more in the west of the country. But when Wycliffe, who was a professor at Oxford, chose that dialect to translate the scriptures into, he really basically defined English, and that's what became English. And it's hard work if you try and read Wycliffe's English, because there's different letters that you don't use anymore. The alphabet's a little bit different and stuff, and you get and you still got, like, especially Middle English, you had a lot of basically German words as well. So it's quite difficult to read that. You almost need it transliterating. But by the time you get to Tyndale, he was the next one, I think probably 1400s, when he does his it's much more recognizable as English. Still hard work, but it's much more recognizable, as you can just about understand it. And in the sense, with the King James, they even in their terms, you see, they modernized the English, so even in there, I mean, it's archaic to us now in Elizabethan. We can understand it, but that's the reason why you need new translations and you need new versions, because you must be able to access the scriptures in the idiom and in the language. And there is arguments about the decay of the language, and that it's become more trivial and become less depth. And the reason why certain words are used in the scripture, the reason why they were used, was because they had specific nuances of meaning. And they're all fair enough arguments to be had, but the big distinction really is between translation is whether you're concerned with technical accuracy, or, if you like, a literal, where you're sort of looking at almost like a word for word, sort of like equivalence, and you're only adjusting for where there's fundamental variations between the language, where you don't express them, where the idiom is just basically different, but your basic model is as close to the literal translation as it can possibly be. So you get versions, for example, like the excuse me, the New American Standard Bible. If you've seen the New American Standard Bible, that's an example of an exceptionally good basically literal translation. Very, very good. Even now, I think it's one of the best versions you can get. If you want to get sort of like a modern version, particularly get the what I'm going to read from here now is what's called the New English Translation. That's an excellent version for a modern translation. But if you want something that's much but the Net Bible makes the Net Bible distinctive, is that it's what's called a dynamic translation. So what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to whereas the literal is trying to be technically accurate, with the Net Bible's trying to be much more dynamic, in the sense it's trying to express the meaning and trying to bring out the meaning, because sometimes technical language or a literal translation might not bring out what's really meant. And so you've got this whole spectrum of Bible translations basically from the paraphrase, which is taking the dynamic principle to the ultimate extreme, where it's difficult to tie it's almost very difficult to tie what's in the it's very, very interpretive, and it's very much somebody's subjective view of what the text actually means. And that's always been the argument of the literalists against those who are in dynamic, who believe in sort of dynamic translation, is because the more dynamic you get, the more subjectivity and the more bias of the translator uh, can actually creep into, the more their theology and the more their views and their presuppositions can find their way into the text. So the literalist is always saying the best, if you've ever read Young's literal translation, he's on what you would consider the most literal of the literal. And some people would actually say, when you try and read it, you actually find that it's not even almost English. It's too literal. And so that's like, so the something like the Net I think is a really good translation, because it's dynamic, but nevertheless it's very close to the text. And where they deviate from the literal text, they tell you, and they tell you why they deviated in most cases. So I think I'm very much still, I value the modern translation, the dynamic translation model, because it is very much about trying to understand the meaning. But you do have to recognize that if you're trying to amplify or to bring out the meaning, and there is a translation called the Amplified Translation, which tries to expand what's in the text and tries to give you more information about the word, and perhaps tries to give you a bit of background regarding the idiom. And it's probably a good at this point as well to mention the significance and the difference between when you say get the New English translation, and then you get, say, the New American Standard Version, or the Authorized Version. Why is it? There's a significance when something's called a version. It actually means that normally it's got like an academic review committee, and so you'll have people that say who are experts in Hebrew, who are concentrating on a particular set of, say, books from the Hebrew. It might be experts on Job, they might be experts on Ecclesiastes or Proverbs. They might have expertise in particular genres, because the biblical texts obviously have different genres. So you have you've got stuff uh, which is pastoral stuff. You've got prophetic stuff. You've got uh, the the proverbs and that type of literature, what's called wisdom literature. So you get these as well, and then you've got historical books like Chronicles, but nevertheless within Chronicles there's this commentary of the chronicler or chroniclers. uh, there is a theological commentary that those chroniclers have put in as they were documenting the history of the nation, because they're looking back and they're making comments about why did this happen. So they're writing the history, and that's the whole argument about interpreting history and how you interpret history, how you write it. So you in a version, you had those experts, subject matter experts, who understand those issues surrounding the text, and it's normally academic, and it'll have a committee. And so in a sense, you would think it would be far more rigorous, and so the standards would generally be higher. You would think, if it was, say, like a version, it's basically implying there's a far more of an academic approach to the text, the different text, and there's experts who are concentrating on small areas. Whereas when you get stuff like, say, like the Message Bible or the Passion translation, they're actually basically the work of one person. And so, lots of people I know, love, say, for example, really, love quoting from the Passion, or they quote, but you have to probably understand and think, from the point of view of rigor, if unless and from the, there's probably, it's very easy if you're the only translator to push your view of the text, which obviously you're doing to a greater or lesser degree as a translator. They, that it's not a science, it's not a perfect objective science. Language isn't something that's one-to-one equivalence between different languages, even languages within the same language group we call, English thing, and the European language we tend to call them the Indo-European languages. They've got, because the grammar is basically the same, the structures are the same, but even there's not like a one-to-one equivalence. And when you have sentences with words joined together, they don't necessarily mean the same things. There's the whole philosophy of language sort of like comes into that. So so they're really sort of like interesting things. So, but that was, again, I think that's just filling in, giving some background information about sort of like the biblical text and what the difference between a version and a translation is, and the degree of objectivity and subjectivity. They're important. Some translations are known for and some versions are known for their dynamic sort of like nature, the dynamic, but some versions nevertheless, like perhaps the NIV is probably one of the most famous versions, which is also quite dynamic in its approach to the text. The Good News Bible, again, is another modern version, which is the one I used when I first became a Christian, sort of like 21, 22. To be honest, that was the only one I could really understand. I even found the NIV one a bit difficult to read. The Good News Bible I found was really, it had some really good features about it. I think the text is very clean, very clear. It's something that's, depending, at different points of in the sense of your spiritual walk, you can and when you and depending what the purpose is as well, as to whether you're reading it just for devotional purposes or whether you're reading it for study purposes, and then you get other versions and other approaches to the text. And when I started formally studying stuff as well, when I was learning the biblical languages, I'm not to any degree I'm sort of a beginner as far as Hebrew is concerned, but as far as New Testament Greek is concerned, I'm pretty good. And the Old Testament, there's an Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which again is really, really interesting, because it goes all the way back to the time of Alexander the Great, when you had that enormous Greek Empire, and it was one of the earliest translations from the Hebrew, whereas what we would consider the modern Hebrew, or the Hebrew, the Masoretic, what people would say the Masoretic text, which is what the Hebrew scriptures are generally translated from now, which when people talk about the Hebrew, they mean the Masoretic text. Those only go back to sort of like 600 AD in a sense, whereas your Greek Septuagint goes all the way back, maybe 1000 BC or something. And so, and it's very, very interesting because of the history, because what happened to the Jewish people, that even when you are reading the translations in stories of Jesus in Luke, and when they often quote the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew, because in a sense it's a bit like if you were sort of like in the Amish community, and when they have some of the festivals, and some of the original work, the original material was written in Old High German, very sort of like archaic, ancient, it's not spoken anymore. But when there's like a formal sort of, some sort of, in certain, Amish communities, who are traditional, they would be reading stuff in this formal High German. But it's to the speaker, that's going to sound really, really weird, and it's going to be very difficult for them to relate to and connect to and to understand. And Hebrew it was interesting, because the Hebrew in the time of Jesus, because of the conquering and the destruction of the nation, you had sort of, Hebrew was very much more like that formal religious language that was used for special occasions. But people were probably much more, they were speaking sort of like the language of the people was very much more Aramaic, which used the same alphabet and was related to Hebrew. But it's a bit like, there'd been centuries of separation, and so it's become a language in its own right. and then obviously you had the Romans speaking Latin, and then you had Greek. So the whole linguistic mix, and what actually goes into the scriptures, and actually understanding why are they in Greek, why they were written in Greek, and the relationship to the Greek Old Testament. And there's lots of these issues that help you sort of understand the human history and the subjectivity as well as the objective nature of biblical study. So all this sort of like stems from this little comment I made on the New English translation here, on Net Translation. But I think this is good. It's literal. It's but it's dynamic, and the netbible.org is great as a study tool if you're interested in digging more into this and getting some background. And not all their commentary, as with all commentary and all sort of analysis, you need multiple sort of like sources, because you will get bias, and you do get in discussion of particular passages as well, you can tell where the commentator's coming from. And so there are those issues there. So as I've managed to talk again for that period of time, I will have another very short break so I can get myself something from my throat. But then we absolutely will start with Romans 13. Okay, see you shortly.